Hello again, Athish Gaming here to talk to you about what I would want to see out of Classic Plus. And just to make this clear, this is entirely a wish list of things that I would want. I wouldn't expect this any earlier than after a Classic Wrath of the Lich King. In fact, I think it would be impossible to deliver before a Classic Wrath of the Lich King, and the chances of anything like this happening are astronomically low. So why do I want it? Well, it's fun. I'm not going to go through this line by line in detail other than to explain my reasoning. If you want to read this document, I will leave a link in the description below, and let's get started. So, what is the biggest thing? So the goal you want to have is retaining the classic feel while modernizing the world, raid mechanics, classes, and economy. And what do I mean by retaining the classic feel? Well, we don't want to iron everything out. There's some things we want to optimize, make easier, make harder, but for the most part, we want to keep the world the same. And in service of that, we're going to revamp the zones, mostly on a graphical level. So keep landmarks, layouts, but there are places that could definitely have some visual fidelity added. Think like the Barrens. The Barrens is cool. I like the Barrens, but there's vast tracts of the Barrens that are just boring. There are zones, especially later zones, that are really cool, but don't have anything interesting happening in them. I think like the Burning Steps for Horde. There's like 3 quests, and there's all this cool stuff there that isn't used in one Warlock quest. More stuff would be good. Quests. I would like quests to be primarily focused around expanding the lore. Now, people complain that there isn't a lot of quests at the upper levels, and this is true. And this is part of the reason why boosting is popular, is because there are just dead levels at later levels where you are running out of quests to do. And I think that there's a lot of missed story opportunities, which I'll get to more in zone specific areas, but way more story, especially because it's so long after Warcraft 3 came out. A lot of people playing this probably have never played Warcraft 3 and could use a refresher for some of the story. So putting that refresher into endgame quest zones, or even mid-level quest zones, 30, 40, 50, would be really good. Flight paths and graveyards, keep them minimal. Part of the reason why Classic is good is because it has limited flight paths and limited graveyards. You have to travel around the world to get places. So the only time I would add them is if there was a very, very good reason. Mobs should remain relatively strong and difficult to player strength. This is obvious. I mean, some classes are going to chew through mobs regardless. Hunters, mages, etc. But pulling 2 or 3 should still be like, ooh, and keep you on your toes. And this is part of the fun, is optimizing your efficiency so that you can clear these mobs even on classes that aren't necessarily fully created. Zones. There should be some new zones. The server population is larger, and you could really feel it that people are being squeezed into zones beyond their initial capacity. So talk about those new zones that I would add. Professions, I think they need to be rebalanced. Specifically, enchanting, tailoring, blacksmithing, leatherworking, alchemy all kind of need their own personal power. There's nothing that's even close to engineering. Engineering might be worth staying. I mean, it's a fun profession. It gives you a couple of different things you can do, useful things, teleporters. It could just be that there's some additional stuff for the other people, and then new patterns, and then as far as consumable economy, the consumables should use more herbs and less of only high level herbs. I think integrating low level herbs gives players more reason to go back to old zones. It gives gold farming opportunities to lower level players. Just in general, I think the more you can integrate, having Purple Lotus, Fire Bloom, Khadgar's Whiskers, all those different low-level herbs into higher-level recipes, the more even the herb costs are, and that ends up making the farming opportunities more diverse. Next up, I would nerf world buffs. So, not remove them. I would make it so that only raid buffs are allowed in raids. And by raid buffs, I mean buffs that you get from raids. So this would remove the Uber's buff. Actually, sorry, it would not remove the Uber's buff, but it would change the Uber's buff. So Renthead. And it would add an equivalent for Alliance. It would remove DMT and Songflower would be the big ones that would get removed. And they would also all be updated so that they could be more easily gathered. So the biggest one you can see here is adding Zandalari representatives to Org and Stormwind. This would also be part of the Cthulhu buff. So you would turn in your Cthulhu Eye, and then afterwards you get a quest to turn in something to someone in your capital city, and it would give an equivalent to the ZG buff. So that it wouldn't just be ZG, it would be Power of the Old Gods. ZG and Cthulhu would be the same buff. So more easier ways to get buffs, and overall power level of those buffs is lower. So the optimal way to play will still be the kind of hardcore mode, don't die, don't lose your buffs, but the amount of power you're getting from those buffs is less. So this keeps the classic feeling of hardcore mode, don't die, kind of competition kind of level. But if you're a guild that doesn't want to get world buffs, or you lose them, you're not just completely screwed. Your class will still function. You'll still be able to work even without those buffs. And then PvP system, I don't have a great way of redoing this. Maybe could have a ranked battlegrounds. There's a lot of different things you could do, and I would trust a person who is more interested in PvP to do it. And then these are some of the controversial changes, and I wouldn't even know if you should do them. Would be have Draenei and Blood Elves, and that's what Draenei and Blood Elves in Classic. Yeah, I would just have them be earlier versions of them, and you're like, but that destroys the class balance. Yeah, if we're gonna have more difficult raids, which we'll get into, being able to balance them between the two factions would be good. You could even have story tie-ins with Chromie, in that this world actually acknowledges that it's not the true Classic, that it is been altered in some way. And this is why I think that with the quests and stuff, you could have interesting quests using, say, the Infinite Dragonflight. Might help if I actually spell that correctly. You could have interesting quests in the background of the Infinite Dragonflight and other Caverns of Time related things, messing with the timeline. You can see glimpses of the future and such, and that could be a really interesting background mystery added to why are things different. So going into new zones, the new zones I see pretty obviously Hyjal, Northern Plaguelands, and then expanding on the Blasted Lands, Burning Steppes, Wetlands, and Azshara and Deadwood and Pass. So Hyjal, Northern Plaguelands, pretty obvious. These would both be added, and they would be phased in a lot, sort of like Silithus is. Hyjal will be a lot of like a Warcraft 3 kind of quest zone as far as explaining old story, and it will give just another level 60 zone for players to expand, especially a level 60 zone that's more accessible to Night Elves, who really kind of lack anything interesting to do starting in Darnassus. Northern Plaguelands tie in with Naxxramas, and then as far as the new zones to expand, Stoner, Blasted Lands, Netherguard Keep, Tainted Scar rework to level 60 demon focused area, as in non-elite demons. The back area where Kazak is normally will still be level 60 elites, but the normal area where the initial entry area will be someplace you can actually quest with level 60s. So hard-hitting, tough mobs, but soloable. Burning Steppes, I don't actually know if it need additional outposts. I just think that Burning Steppes needs additional quests, especially expanding on the Dark Horde, storyline. I think that that's one of the most underwhelming storylines is the whole lead up to Rend. Like, is you get barely anything about it. Like, you don't know Rend at all. You kill him, and he's supposed to be this big lore character, and I think that could be expanded upon. Grim Batal should be an instance. Um, IMO. That'd be a good instance. That Azara, finish Azara. Like, it's a cool area. It should be finished. Um, Deadwind Pass, also, we'll get to that. As far as new instances, I think this is key. Like, people know all the instances, and then you can update them and change them, but adding new stuff to do will really breathe life into this Classic Plus. So you have, I would add Grim Batal, and this is stopping, essentially a teaser for Deathwing happening 2 expansions later. I believe that's where Deathwing is. Correct me if I'm wrong. But this is more Dark Horde storyline. This could even be before Ubers. We could rework Ubers a little bit to have this be required for getting into Ubers, is doing Grim Batal. Then you have some kind of cool, maybe it's a bit mishmash, maybe you need to reverse the amounts, but then you have some cool storyline and a build up to Rend rather than just, oh, there's Rend. Roots of Hyjal, this is just a 5-man in Hyjal. This is a Twilight Hammer lead up, some Old God tie-ins, especially Old God tie-ins specifically to Cthulhu. I think that the Silithids are really well done, actually, in Classic. There's lots of hints. You have the hints in the Barrens, you have the Thousand Needles, Tenaris, Ungoro. There's a steady buildup of, for Alice even, there's a steady buildup of, there's this weird threat coming out of the south. You get there and it's this, nightmare bug desert obelisk land. It's great. It needs to be something a little bit for the old gods too. And you don't necessarily have to tie them together initially, but Roots of Hyjal would be a pretty good way to introduce the Twilight Hammer and talk about what they are doing. But speaking of that, Silithid Incursion, also a good pre-AQ raid. You could have more story. You could explain the whole war of against the Silithids, the prehistoric war. The story could be explained in this instance. People get exposed to what is a pretty cool story without having to read a bunch of text boxes and seek it out, and I think that would be good. And then later, Crypts of Karazhan, Scarlet Fortress, Deathholm, Timbermaw. I won't get into much detail on these, just you can read what level of gear I think they should have and when they should be located. This would be how I change the phases to incorporate them. This is probably a better place to talk about them anyways. So, phase 1 is all the updated zones besides Northern Plaguelands and Nixium Mongor. This means Hyjal is in at the beginning. There just isn't anything there. Phase 2 is the PvP system, Battlegrounds, Timbermaw Dungeon. Phase 3 is Dire Maul, Prelude Quest to Blackwing Lair and Grim Batal. Could maybe switch those actually, but that's something I could update later. Phase 4, BWL, new crafting / faction recipes, Northern Plaguelands. Phase 5, ZG, Hyjal quest expanded, Cenarian Silithus, Cenarian Circle quests, Southern Ungoro raid added, Roots of Hyjal, Twilight Attack activity. So this is like having like a Scourge Invasion type deal. Then you have the AQ, and then part of the way through AQ you have the Deadwind Pass stuff, Crypts of Karazhan, Northern Plaguelands, and then finally you get Nexramus, the Scarlet 5-man, and Deathholm. So I think that's really what we're missing from, especially the later phases, is there isn't any new 5-mans. And it would be really cool to have some hard 5-mans added later in the game. Like, this is a 5-man intended for raiders. That'd be cool. I'd like to see a Deathholm 20-man. Let's see what we can have people do with a hard instance early on. As far as other things, the buff cap being removed, I think this would be good. Other than that, or they have the Battle Guardian elixir system. Either one works, but debuff cap, I think this is pretty obvious. They've raised this immediately after Classic. people should be able to use their things. Weapon skill racial changes, these could be flexible. They could just be more expertise. But essentially, I would go and implement the TBC system for rating. The reason being is that you can still have unique items with over or under budget, and I would really prefer that to have things that are kind of outliers, like Savage Gladiator Chain just having a ton of crit, 2% crit, whatever that equals, having that. But I think the mixing and matching and being able to have more flexibility could lead to having more unique gear rather than lots of repeats of, oh, it's a bow with 1% crit and some primary stats. Ooh, I think if this is done correctly, it should be in the service of having better gear and more interesting gear. I would go with expertise rather than weapon skill. Weapon skill is one of the big nerfs. You could include weapon skill, but I would make it a lot more accessible, especially for various weapons and on higher level gear. It creates such a gulf between people that have weapon skill and people that don't. And in order to change it, you have to mess with the combat engine a lot. So I would just kind of not include them. World buffs. Well, first off, boss health. I'd increase it, just in general. All bosses could use a bit more HP. Specifically, early bosses could use a fair amount more HP. People know how to play, they know how to deal damage. And even with the nerfs to world buffs, it's not going to be enough. So world buffs, they get removed upon entering a raid if they have a star. So this is Songflower and DMT. And as you notice, they're still good. 5% melee, ranged, and spell haste. 5% spell crit, 88 attack power, 5% all stats. This is kind of what you can get. Still really good, but not quite as powerful. And lastly, changes to racial to classes. So if we are keeping weapon skill, this becomes a lot more important. If we're not, then I still think it's worth having these expanded weapon specializations, and you can agree or disagree. So essentially, orcs become slightly better hunters, and they get improved blood fury but nerfed hardiness. Their weapon specialization changes to one-handed axe, two-handed axe, and unarmed, okay, fist weapons. Taurens can basically be unchanged except get one-handed maces, two-handed maces, guns. I think that's what's best for Tauren. That gives you druids, warriors, hunters all having options. Troll weapon specialization. I think daggers, bows, polearms. I think that makes the most sense to me. Rogues, that's rogues, hunters. It's kind of what I think of when I think of trolls. Making regeneration. Include mana, interesting bonus for casters, and then skinning skill. I mean, if they're the preeminent hunters, then having additional skinning skill would be good. Undead, slight nerf to will. I think swords and staffs would be good for them. So it makes sense to me. And then blood elves, like I said, this depends on whether or not we would want to see that kind of class balance. It depends on how hard you want to make the raids. The harder the raids are, the more you want to have matching class availability. I would add every man for himself to humans. It's going to sound weird, but I think just parity-wise, you're going to want that, especially with them losing the specialness of their weapon specialization. Dwarves, I think axes and guns. Gnomes, daggers, staves, and wands. Don't really know what else they would have. Slight bonus to elves and have them be bows, crossbows, polearms, and daggers. Maybe they don't get daggers. I just think that having a one-handed weapon would be good. And then these are kind of my overall changes for classes. I'm not going to get specific into them. I just want to summarize in that if a class doesn't necessarily have to be super good in damage, but if they aren't going to be good in damage, they should at least be a bit more fun to play. Specifically, I think of Balanced Druid and uh, Shadow Priest. They aren't going to be doing the most damage, but they also are classes with some of the worst mana problems. Like, you would think that if they did great damage but had really bad mana problems, then it would be kind of interesting. You'd be trying to ration yourself, pace yourself, keep it going as long as possible, and you get more gear, and you can sustain longer. It'd be fun. But they do bad damage and have terrible mana sustain, so it's just no fun either way. So I think that should be the big thing to address, is making the bad specs a bit more supporty and giving them more sustain so that you can play them without having to constantly chug mana potions and dark runes. That's kind of and also give people more interesting niches, like, for example, give Balanced Druids better AoE. Like, if Hurricane's really good and they become a valuable AoE contributor, hey, that'd be good. Also, I would be essentially getting more threat to all the tanks. It's hard enough to tank. Essentially, a slight increase to bear and defensive stances base threat, rather than buffing the talents that boost it. And that's just to make it so that if you're off tanking, it's a bit easier, especially because if classes are better, there's more threat, that sort of thing. And then, not going to go through all of these, but lastly, tier gear. I think having a set of gear per spec is really good. And the way I would do this is not necessarily tokens. I do say tokens here. I do think that you lose a little something with tokens, especially with enchanting and disenchanting. I think kind of that we could potentially have these be quest based. So you could turn in the gear to a vendor, and that vendor would be able to, or quest giver, and that quest giver would be able to change your gear into the right spec. So we'll say that in how Classic works, it's always healer tank gear that drops, unless you're a pure DPS class, in which case it's DPS gear. Healer gear primarily, and then if you have a tank spec, then it's tank spec, etc. You take that to a specific person in the world. Let's say you're a priest. There's going to be a Shadow Priest trainer, and they will desecrate or infuse your gear with the shadow. And maybe there's a cost, maybe there's a quest you have to do. Maybe it's just as simple as, here, take my gear. Thank you for the desecrated shadow infused gear. You do that, and then you get the gear, and that kind of keeps the economy in order for disenchanting things, and you get a little bit of a story bit for you having to go and do this off-spec thing in order to make your gear more savage if you're a druid, or be in tune with enhance your strength of the elements or whatever. I think that would be good. And if you notice in here, most of these are focused around quality of life improvements, especially for healers and hybrids. So, good 2 and 3 pieces. In many cases, I would be open to change on these. These are kind of things I threw out just thinking about what would be good to have. For example, the tier 2 3-piece shadow is the same as the holy one, and it's a good bonus. And then kind of interesting things that make shadow more easy and fun to play. Same with enhancement. Good kind of like party but melee critical strikes, grant party 5% melee haste. People would want an enhanced shaman then, but it doesn't take the enhanced shaman over the top, personally. And a warrior DPS set, I talked earlier about how warriors should get nerfed, and warriors and rogues and mages should probably get a little bit of nerfs. But if you're interested in that, you could read specifically the document. Other than that, like I said, I want to keep the game changed enough to be new and to better capture the feeling of novelty, of exploring a new world, that we got in old classic. Like, you can't just release the same game and get the same feelings. So having that kind of zone revamp, new quests, changing the instances to be more, have new mechanics or be more challenging, or the number of people, I think would all lead to making a more authentic classic experience than just re-releasing it. And I would hope that these changes would actually cause those feelings. Anyways, if you want to comment, tell me I'm an idiot for doing this, uh, say that it's a pipe dream, which I know, or whatever, put weird spam links in my comments like the last video, uh, then leave a comment. Otherwise, you don't have to like, you don't have to or subscribe. I am not a professional. So anyway, but thanks for watching.